Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kelly Young, and I am legal counsel with the Justice Collaborative. Welcome, and welcome back for some of you to the latest installment of our Blueprint series. And to give you some background, the Justice Collaborative's Blueprint for a Safer and More Just America is a comprehensive framework for national criminal justice reform and outlines concrete steps to address the country's mass incarceration crisis and provides actionable solutions to creating a more fair and equitable justice system. So one of the key principles outlined in the blueprint is to allow people to change and grow. And on that topic today, our awesome panelists will discuss how states' use of extreme sentencing not only drives mass incarceration, but also fails to acknowledge a person's capacity to change and grow. And so before I introduce them though, I always want to remember to thank you all, our justice volunteers, for the great work that you do. You have mobilized quickly to start building the most comprehensive database of prosecutor elections in the country over the next 2 years so that voters can be as educated as possible as elections approach. And this month, more than 1,000 of you quickly signed on to a petition calling for investment in real solutions and not more jails, which helped create pressure needed to cancel the McCarthy contract in Los Angeles. So thank you all for the astounding work that you do, and I really, really appreciate it. And towards the end of this, you'll hear from Molly Bernstein, our Associate Director for Volunteer Research and Advocacy, about how you can be more involved in our teams and work to end extreme sentences. As our panelists start the discussion, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comment box along with your name and where you're from, and we'll do our best to get to them during the Q&A session. And so our panelists, today joining us, we have Kate Chatfield, Senior Advisor for Legislation and Policy with the Justice Collaborative, Earlonne Woods, co-producer, co-host, and co-creator of Ear Hustle, Sarah Lessbader, Senior Legal Counsel and Curator of the Daily Appeal with the Justice Collaborative and the Appeal, and Celeste Trusty, Pennsylvania State Policy Director with FAM, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. So thank you all for being with us. And to start us off, Kate is going to frame the conversation and let us know why we should care about extreme sentences and what we even mean when we say that.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Thanks everyone for joining in. So I just want to give a very brief overview about what we talk about when we talk about extreme sentences. And I want to start with an introduction as to why it's so significant in the situation in which we find ourselves today in this country, where we have 2.2 million people in our jails and prisons, and we have 4.5 million people under government surveillance and supervision. And extreme sentences very much drives these. And it was something that Sarah actually wrote a few months ago in the appeal that I think summed it up quite beautifully in a way. She was writing about the death penalty, and she said what the death penalty does is it normalizes extreme sentences. And I think we can take that all the way down. And what extreme sentences do is it normalizes, like a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, then normalizes a 40-year sentence. That normalizes a 25-year to life or a 15-year to life sentence. That in turn normalizes and even makes desirable, if you're sitting, in the defendant's position, a sentence of 10 years or 15 years for a nonviolent offense. That in turn makes in California, a triad for felonies, 16 months, 2 years, or 3 years. That looks great for a low-level felony. And then, that works all the way down. So it's almost as if we've set this acceptable maximum and we've stepped down, but the steps are so high and they're so much higher than in other Western democracies. So I think when we talk about mass incarceration, we have to talk about extreme sentencing as a driver of that mass incarceration. So, so with that, but I think it's important to understand the various ways that the various definitions of sentencing. So obviously an extreme sentence is life without the possibility of parole. That's referred to colloquially as LWOP. So that's an official, one is sentenced to LWOP. That can be, that can come about in two ways. Sometimes that's a jury is given a choice between a death sentence, and then the alternative is LWOP if they don't vote to execute somebody. Sometimes the district attorney can just charge LWOP. They don't have to seek the death penalty. They can just charge a special circumstance that would lead to life without the possibility of parole. In some states, that is the sentence for the particular crime, and Celeste is going to talk about, in particular, Pennsylvania. And in other states, sometimes that can be a habitual offender, or a 3-strike sentence can lead to a life without the possibility of parole. So that's LWOP, like I'm going to call that like official LWOP. But then there's also something like de facto LWOP or virtual LWOP. And that is the Sentencing Project, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from their amazing research. But the virtual LWOP or de facto LWOP is what they define as 50 years to life. Other places, other organizations define it as 40 years to life, like 40 years. It's de facto LWOP. The chances are greater that you're getting out of prison in a box than that you're walking out. And then there is, so that's de facto life. And then there are sentences where the maximum sentence is life imprisonment, 15 years to life, 25 years to life. So the minimum is 15 years. The maximum, the parole board, or if there's a parole board, they can keep you in for life. I want to note something that before this tough on crime era in the 1990s, the default when life sentence, when like in the California Penal Code, it says a person shall be sentenced to life, that was 7 years. 7 years, and that still is true in some crimes, that the default is life. So sometimes you will see that in a penal code that is a life sentence, and you have to look at what that life sentence means. But at any rate, it's 15 years or 25 years to life. That is a sentence that maybe on the face of it is not a de facto or virtual life sentence, but it can become a life sentence by virtue of the fact that somebody cannot be let out on parole, or parole is just a joke. And that was the situation in California until quite recently, where the parole grant rates were so low. So that is what we talk about when we talk about, LWOP or life sentences. Right now there are a few certain states that have people serving official LWOP sentences. In California, there are over 5,000 people serving an LWOP sentence. In Florida, there are almost 9,000 people serving an LWOP sentence. But that does not include people that are serving a virtual or a de facto LWOP sentence. And those are those extreme 40 years, 50 years to life sentence. So the Sentencing Project estimates that there are, and actually maybe it's more than an estimate, but as of 2016, there were 206,268 people in the United States serving an LWOP sentence, or what is a de facto LWOP sentence, and they define that as 50 years or more. So that can come about in many ways. It's under 3-strike sentencing, or even other habitual offenders. the judge can stack the sentences so people can end up with 75 years to life or 60 years to life. So again, that's 206,000 people. And I think I struggle with this because we throw around these numbers, but for example, in California, sometimes I try to think about myself like in a crowd of 5,000 people, like in a small stadium or at a concert. 5,000 people. I don't want to be in a crowd that big. I mean, that's a large number of people. And if you sort of try to like emotionally enter into that feeling of being with 5,000 people, I think maybe hopefully we can break through the sense that these are just numbers without meaning. And the same for 200,000 people. 200,000 people. I mean, what would that feel like to be, in a place with 200,000 people that are going to be in prison for the rest of their natural life? It's an extraordinary amount of people. I almost, my mind can't even conceive of 2.2 million people with being in the presence of that many people. So that is the overview of the extreme, the life sentence, the LWOP, and then the de facto, and then the life sentences. I'm going to sort of talk about some challenges that have been made to LWOP, and some of those challenges, most of those challenges have come about in the juvenile setting with the Supreme Court decisions, United States Supreme Court decisions, Miller and Graham, and another one, Montgomery, that are saying that you can't sentence juveniles to life without the possibility of parole. In California, the California Supreme Court has come out with, okay, well, let me tell you a case. So in California, there was a case in Ray Nunez, and there's a 14-year-old boy, and he was sentenced to multiple terms of life without the possibility of parole. He was an accomplice in aggravated kidnapping. Nobody was killed. I believe nobody was injured, shot, but he was sentenced to multiple counts of life without the possibility of parole. So Brian Stevenson actually came in on his appeal, or actually after his appeal and on his habeas, and said this is cruel and unusual punishment to sentence a 14-year-old boy to life without the possibility of parole. So the California Supreme Court took that, they sent it back down to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals said, you're right, that's, it's unacceptable to have a 14-year-old sentenced to LWOP. So we sent it back down to the Orange County Superior Court, and you review it and do a resentencing. So the judge did a resentencing hearing, and he said, okay, I have to strike the LWOP sentence, but I'm going to sentence you to 175 years to life. So technically you don't have LWOP, you have 175 years to life. So of course that went back up, and ultimately the California Supreme Court ruled that a juvenile cannot be sentenced to more than 50 years to life. They have to have an opportunity for parole. Now that was before something called youth offender parole hearings, and the youth offender law came into being in California, and the legislature and Governor Brown signed this law that said that juveniles, and then the age was raised up to the age of 25, saying that they could get resentenced to 15 or get they needed a meaningful opportunity for parole at 15 or 25 years. So that's where some movement has been for those under the age of 25. There are carve-outs in that, unfortunately. And we can talk about that maybe if we have time later. The other way that we really get to or a main way that we really get to LWOP, and cut me off, anybody, for Kelly particularly if I'm going on too long. I want to leave time for the people of this. Another way that we can get to it, and Erlan's going to be speaking on this more, is through sentencing enhancements. And those are the a 25-year to life firearm enhancement, a 10-year enhancement for gangs, and the 3 strikes or habitual offender, depending on what they call it in a particular state. Those sorts of enhancements that are not the underlying sentence, maybe this, but then they add 25, 10, 15 years on for that. And so that has been a driver of extreme sentencing in there. So should I can talk more, but again, I've spoken long enough, so.
Thank you, Kate, so much. And so we're gonna hand it over to Celeste to talk about, LWAP, particularly in Pennsylvania, and then medical parole and aging out legislation.
Yeah, so Pennsylvania is unfortunately still one of the handful of states in the country that has mandatory life without parole as a sentencing option for first and second degree murder. So, there are over 600 people in Pennsylvania serving a mandatory life without parole sentence who didn't even actually take a life. Those people were sometimes lookouts, or they didn't know what was about to happen, and unfortunately somebody did lose their life, but they are then sentenced to mandatory life without parole. In Pennsylvania, we have more than 5,400 people serving life without parole. And again, it's a mandatory sentence. And, when we look at these things, we have to look at it in the framework of the fact that when you look at mandatory sentencing, somebody's being sentenced on the worst moment of their life. And when you remove judicial discretion from these sentencing issues, you're looking at it and saying, well, that person, everything else about their life can't be involved in their sentencing, or that the capacity for change is not even considered in that sentencing. And so really, when you look at mandatory life without parole, a lot of these folks who are now incredible mentors inside of the prisons, who have completely changed, completely redeemed themselves, and are doing amazing things for their communities, our society is saying, well, no, none of that matters. I know that we on the outside have the capacity to change, but unfortunately, we don't believe you have the capacity to change. And that's really something that's driving mass incarceration in Pennsylvania as well. But again, it doesn't make any sense. At that point, there's no return on investment. There's been such research showing that it's not the length of a sentence that really works to deter crime. It is more the certainty and the swiftness of punishment. So why do we have life without parole, right? And so we know, again, there's research that shows that most people do age out of crime, especially people who offend violently. Once they're in their 30s, that chance of them reoffending really does drop off. But in Pennsylvania right now, we have over 10,000 people who are incarcerated in Pennsylvania who are over the age of 50. And so once you start thinking about that, as you age, obviously it costs more money to incarcerate someone, because all of us, our bodies start to break down. We start to get, those aging sicknesses and things like that. And we are keeping people in prison so long when the public safety threat is almost nothing. So we really need to look at it. Obviously we want to protect public safety as a main goal here, but at the same time, you want to be able to use resources, taxpayer resources, in ways that will protect public safety, but at the same time, do things that are smart, that tend to reduce crime and actually allow people to come home and have a second chance, be reunited with their family, and be able to prove that they have changed as well. So in Pennsylvania, there is really a push to look at medical parole legislation, which would allow people to, go up before the parole board and be released, if they're having some medical issues. And also, we really want to talk about second chances, and that would include aging out legislation. Like I talked about before, there is the age crime curve that shows that people do tend to age out of crime and stop committing offenses. And so really, when we're looking at aging out, we should really be recognizing those things. We should be basing our policies on evidence and science. And if we know that people are much less likely to offend as they age, we need to start looking at that and understanding that there are people who, if they go before the parole board, are going to be able to come home, be amazing for their communities, and then also reduce the burden on taxpayers as well.
Thank you, Celeste, so much. And so now that we kind of have the legal context of how we got to a space where we have these extreme sentences, we think it's always important to talk about what that real life impact is. And so Celeste, since you just spoke, can you just continue and bring us into that?
Yeah, so honestly, one of my favorite things to do is to go inside prisons and meet with people who have been sentenced to extreme sentencing. And honestly, every single time I go in, I am blown away by the people that I meet. I get some of the best policy ideas while I'm meeting with people in prison. And so what we really need to do is understand that when we are sentencing people to virtual life and actual life sentences, we are removing people from the community. We are separating families. We're removing mothers from their children, fathers from their children. And that has real life consequences, for children who grow up with parents who are incarcerated. Their life outcomes really look a little bit different than somebody whose parents haven't been incarcerated. Thinking about going into a prison and seeing children having to go through metal detectors, having people go and be turned away at a prison because maybe they have underwire in their bra, or they're wearing a sleeveless shirt, or they're not wearing the right shoes. I know the rules. I've actually gone and had, I didn't pass a metal detector because I had gotten metal inserted in my body during a surgery, and I forgot to ask my surgeon for documentation. And so when you're talking about the impact of extreme sentencing on communities, we really have to start understanding that when people serve sentences, it's not just those people who are being punished. It's the family members as well, the community members as well. Think about the impact, the financial impact of going to have to visit somebody in prison. I know people right now who, I'm outside of Philadelphia, and they're incarcerated all the way across the state, 7 hours away, but their families in Philadelphia. So they don't get visits as often as they should. And we know that maintaining those bonds with your family and your community is one thing that really helps people while they're incarcerated, but also it helps people in reentry as well. So we have to start thinking about punishment as not just a punishment for a person who's offended, but we have to start looking at the impact of that punishment on communities and families as well. And until we do that, we're really not going to be able to shift that narrative. We understand that if people offend, sometimes there needs to be a punishment. But at what point is enough enough? And when are we going to start recognizing that it's not beneficial for society to just lock people away and act like they don't have the capacity for change?
Absolutely. Erlan, and can you just talk a little bit about out of your own experience?
Okay, there we go. Say that again.
I was just asking if you could just speak up out of your own experience.
Yes, I was just listening to Celeste, and a lot of the stuff she was saying is absolutely the truth, because when you're dealing with a long sentence, it don't just affect the person that's sentenced, it affects your family as well. And it really affects you from a financial standpoint. When I got arrested for attempted second-degree robbery, which is probably a maximum of 3 years in prison. And my bail was like $56,000. And that was just for the attempted second-degree robbery. But then they tacked on the fact that I had 3 strikes. So that became $500,000. It was $556,000. And then the officers actually killed the person that I was with. So that added $1 million. So my bail was like $1.5 million, something like that. And financially, that hurts. So what I want to say is when a person gets to prison, usually you're probably in a prison that's a day away from where your family live at. So, your family has to travel, has to make arrangements. The kids have to do the same. I know a lot of times we lie to the kids. We tell them, hey, I'm in a chemical plant and there was some type of outbreak and that's why I'm behind this glass, so those stories pretty much impact your family. But when it gets to going inside of prisons and the stuff that your family is put through, getting into visiting, whether it's strip searches, it's pretty much like your family is treated like a criminal as well because they're associated with you. I think most of the visiting issues I had with being African-American, my sisters may have came in and they might have been voluptuous and they're like, oh, you can't wear this stuff. You got to take this off. But then you look around and you're looking like, oh, you didn't say that to them, but that was pretty much the impact. I know my family used to always hate coming to see me because they have to change clothes. They have to do this. They have to go through this. And by the time they do get in, I only got like a 1-hour visit, 2-hour visit when it could have been longer. You have phone calls. Phone calls, you got to do these collect calls. They call, I remember, I think they changed the policy, but I remember it was like $4 just to accept the call, and then it seemed like it was a scheme because once you accept the call on the phone for like 5 minutes, it hangs up, you got to call back. You know what I'm saying? So it was a gang of different things that I looked at, and I was looking at a lot of other people who had 50 years to life, 200 years to life, 300 years to life, and it wasn't just 25 to life. People under the 3-strike law in California, that was the base term. I think that was like the minimum, and it was up to a few thousand. So that was one of the things that was really bothersome to me, which was the financial aspect of it, because a lot of people these days don't write. Everybody's into emailing, everybody's into texting, you know what I'm saying? And what I learned that if, when you stop knowing about a person and they stop knowing things about you, the communication breaks off. You don't have time you can write a letter all you want, but the process of somebody reading that, if it was a text, yeah, people text these days. And I think the biggest thing to me was the separation of family and friends and being in these isolated prisons and dealing with the prison politics of prison. That's pretty much one of the biggest things that I was dealing with, which actually I checked myself into a mental health program. And I found that being in the mental health program was really rewarding for me because it gave me a chance to talk to someone other than a correctional officer or a fellow prisoner. I think those are some of the things that, that really impacted me through my sentence. And I think mainly not just emotional with the kids, with the family, but I think it was like a financial burden on everybody because it is very, very expensive to go through a prison term. I'm not talking about what you paid your lawyers, which was one thing, but just doing time every day. It's a little community. You got to go to the store, you got to, buy stuff, you got to do this. So it was a very financial burden for me, I think.
Alan, thank you so much for sharing that. And I know you mentioned that you were, sentenced to 31 years to life. And so can you just share what that legal mechanism was that allowed you to be released?
Oh, yeah. When I was 17 years old, I went to jail for kidnap robbery of a drug dealer, one person. And I took it. It was actually one charge, which was 209 kidnap robbery kidnap for ransom. But when I took a plea bargain, the plea bargain was for kidnap robbery, which turned that case into 2 convictions. So when I got out of prison when I was 23, I went back to prison 2 years, 10 months later for the attempted second-degree robbery. So when I was in court for that, they told me that I was a 3-strike candidate because when I was 17, I had 2 strikes from the first case. It was the same offense on the same person, but they counted each conviction as a strike. So I became a 3-strike candidate and I received a total term of 31 years to life plus 26 years to life. And the only reason I'm webinaring right now is because the Honorable Governor Jerry Brown felt it in his heart to commute my sentence, based on a lot of hard work and a lot of other stuff. But and that's why I'm here now. But had it not been for the governor, my first board appearance would be 2028.
We're really happy that you are here, and I know that you're doing a ton of work on, 3 strikes reform in California. We're going to talk about that a little later. But before that, we're going to hear from Sarah about, how we talk about these issues and the role that narrative plays in, reforming these issues.
So I guess I was going to start. Number one, it's really hard to go after Earlonne. I just want everyone to know that. So thank you very much, Earlonne. Any other order, Kelly. So when you start law school, or when I started law school, I remember in my crim class, they talked about what was called the ratchet effect. And you might think you know what the ratchet effect is, but it's not what you think. It's not that kind of ratchet. It's the kind of ratchet where it goes one way, but it doesn't go the other way, right? So it only goes up. And the ratchet they're referring to is sort of the harshness or severity of the criminal system. And that can be kind of quantified or seen numerically in terms of sentencing, right? Like it's really, for a very long time, it was very easy for politicians to run on a campaign of increasing severity, increasing sentences, much harder for a politician to get elected promising to lower sentences, right? So that's why things just kept getting ratcheted up and up. And luckily what we've seen is that thanks to a lot of hard work by many people present and a billion other people, that's changing. And actually some politicians have succeeded on a more decarceratory platform. But most of that has to do with forward-looking reforms. That is, if you're arrested today, will you get a lower sentence than somebody who was arrested 5 years ago? That doesn't really affect the people that are serving extremely long sentences right now. You would need a very politically brave person, or maybe a retiring person, like the outgoing governor of California, to make those kinds of moves. And honestly, even then, they're pretty sparing most of the time. So that's one problem, is that they're not backward looking. I think the other problem is that a lot of this isn't just policy, a lot of it's culture. So in our culture, it's very common that Americans especially equate justice with punishment. And it's like this very cowboy culture of like getting the bad guy means that justice has been served. You actually see it right now with a lot of the people who are affected by Jeffrey Epstein kind of lamenting the fact that he's gone, in the sense that they don't get to take their own vengeance out on him, that's the only way that we can conceive of justice. I don't begrudge those particular people. Those are the victims in that case. But I think as a society, it's a lot of work to try to shift the narrative in terms of what justice is. What is the longest running live action show on television today? I can't see you or hear you, but you could guess if you wanted, it's Law and Order SVU. And obviously the Law and Order empire has had a serious effect on how Americans think about justice, as has a million other sort of cultural touchstones that we associate with justice. So that's all to say that the narrative shifting is just as important as the policy shifting when it comes to the very sort of third rail issue of letting people out of prison, which is much more difficult politically and culturally than it is to say, okay, we'll sentence you to less time in the future. And I think for me, the most important way to tackle this is to see it not as a gift. We're not giving anyone a gift. It's not that we're saying, oh, hey, in the kindness of our heart, our society's heart, we're going to let you out early. No, it's a correction for a mistake. And that mistake caused unnecessary suffering and harm. And that's been sort of beautifully elucidated by my co-panelists already. But I think the main point is not, this is the benevolent thing to do, which it is, or this is the generous thing to do, which it also is, but it's the necessary thing to do, it's the right thing to do, and it's not, and it's merely a correction for a mistake that happened before. And so to the extent that we can, I think that's a really important message to be pushing in whatever form that we can.
Can I just follow up what you're saying? I think what you're saying is so smart, and just, it seems so simple, right? But one of the things I teach this advocacy workshop, and I give everybody a name tag. One of the first things I do is I tell everybody to close their eyes and think of the worst thing they've ever done. And like immediately everyone just gets all shifty and uncomfortable and like opening their eyes and seeing who has their eyes closed. And, I say, okay, so now everybody open your eyes, and what if I had you write that thing down on that name tag, and you had to wear that name tag even for a day, and the name tag wouldn't say anything about you except for the worst thing you've ever done? Like, how would that make you feel? And even if you had to wear that for a work week or a weekend, how would that make you feel if everyone around you would judge you based on the worst moment of your life? And we are human beings. All of us have done some pretty awful things, and we will continue to do that. And so if we can look at ourselves and say, you know what, I've done something that I certainly wouldn't want everyone to judge me based on the rest of my life. Why can't we just apply that to everyone? You know, everyone has made mistakes, but we've all needed grace at some point in time. So I appreciate everything that you're saying. And I think that it's so smart that until we actually shift that narrative, we're really going to have a hard time getting policies that will impact people that are currently in prison, as well as not just people who might be going into prison later.
Awesome, and now we're going to hear from all of you about the work that you're doing right now, either in shifting the narrative or, you know, legislative challenges and other kinds of sentencing reform. And so, Kate, do you want to start first?
Sure. So there is good work going on around this, and I really liked the way Sarah framed this, that it's really a correction. I mean, we started in, we went off the rails starting in about 1978, and we definitely need to course correct. So there have been some movements around second look sentencing that's now in front of in the District of Columbia. There's a federal second look sentencing act that was introduced by Cory Booker and Representative Bass. I think that's really important. And what that does is it allows somebody to go back to court, after they've served, I think it's 20 years in that legislation, go back before the judge to request resentencing. And that's for everybody, life without the possibility of parole on down, to those who have served up to 20 years. So I think that's a very significant legislative movement. There has been a movement in California, but I think I'll turn it over. And I think somebody also asked a question about what's the movement around 3 strikes in California and I'll turn that over to Erlon, because he can talk about that. He's been very involved with that.
Just realized the mouse work. So as with the movement for, you have a couple. Do we want to repeal the California 3 strikes, or do we want to amend the California 3 strikes? I personally want to amend it. I'm pushing for that. I mean, repeal it, and that's what I'm pushing for, because, like I say, I've been in prison with a lot of people that has 3 strikes, and it's crazy. I'm just gonna say this real quick, that when you're in prison, you start like from a level 4, which is maximum security, then you go down to a level 3, and then if you're under the 3 strike law at a particular time, you were considered close custody. So it's only 2 level 2s in the state of California that you can go to. And it's Soledad and it was San Quentin. And when I got to Soledad first, I seen, it was like 70% of the prison was Black. And I realized that everybody there were 3 strikers. And this is the only level 2s you can go to. When I left there and went to San Quentin, it was the same thing, 70% Black. And it's only 2 prisons you can go to, Soledad or San Quentin. So everybody had the 3 strikes. Right now, like I say, I've been around so many people that sentenced under the 3 strikes, arguing with their girlfriend and getting life, to robbing McDonald's and getting 200 years, to one guy had a robbery spree and he received 100 and some years to life. So our push right now is to hopefully get the ballot initiative, or get the right initiative on the ballot in 2020, which is to repeal California law. And it's hard work, but that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you talk about sentencing review units and other sentencing reform taking place?
Sure. So I can't take much credit for doing that much stuff, but I have done some advising and written a good amount about this. And so one thing that's happening in sort of this ad hoc way is called sentence review. And what that means is that prosecutors can, in certain situations, in theory, look at a sentence and say, this is too long. And that's going to be a subjective judgment. Of course, oftentimes what that means is it's not a sentence that a person would get today, right, for the same kind of conduct. Or it could just mean like, this is just morally repugnant. This is like disproportionate. And I can't, it doesn't sit well with me. So I think those, that particular idea, it sounds great, right? Like prosecutors are kind of the ones who in large part got us into this mess. They should take the lead on getting us out of this mess. They should go back and review cases that their offices, secured those convictions, usually by plea bargain, and try to correct for that. And often it's not the prosecutor that's in office who, him or herself, got that conviction, but it's the idea of taking responsibility for our institutional mistakes and going back and correcting them. Sounds great. There are some people doing that now, but that sort of leads me to the first problem with sentence review. I don't know, Kelly, if you want me to go into like kind of the details of how sentence review could work or not. Yeah.
Absolutely, go for it.
Oh, sure. So I think it's really in its like infancy stages, but the idea is like, you'd basically start with an analysis of data, like who's serving long sentences, who's serving disproportionately long sentences. Maybe in a state like Pennsylvania, you've got these mandatory life without parole sentences. Maybe in another state like drug sentences are just crazy. Maybe in California, you have all these three strikers serving these insane sentences, right? There are various patterns of injustice that are actually going to be specific to the state that you're working in. So you look at that data, and the prosecution will have formed like an internal unit devoted to this very thing. So they pull this data, they're looking at it, what should we be focusing on? And then after that, they start going through individual cases. And this can involve meeting with the person who's incarcerated, his or her family, maybe meeting with anyone who was affected by the crime, meeting with like a social worker, anyone who's involved, meeting with people who worked with them while they're incarcerated. And they could make a determination, right? Like, is this person serving a sentence that's too long, and should we do something about it? And if they decide that they are, what they can do is, usually the way it works is petition a judge and say, look, judge, like we messed up, can we please lower the sentence? I'm not sure that there's a situation in which they can do it unilaterally. Like, you probably need a judge for that. That's, again, sounds really good. One issue with that is that what we have found in our work is that it's really hard for prosecutors to find a legal mechanism to do this. So there are prosecutors out there, like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, who have expressed a lot of enthusiasm for starting these units, but they haven't gotten them up and running yet as much as they've wanted because of legal barriers. It's very, very difficult without specific legislation that allows prosecutors to do this, to just go ahead and do it. So there's two solutions. One is you could pass a law that allows prosecutors to do this. That's what California did, and Washington, D.C. Those are the only two places in the country, I believe, that have specific, explicit laws allowing prosecutors to form these units and recommend lower sentences. So pushing for a legislature to pass this kind of law is a great thing to do if you want sentence review to really get up and running. So it's sort of like a joint or like a two-front attack, right? Like, you want to convince prosecutors to do this, but you also might want to consider lobbying a legislature to pass that kind of a law. And the second problem, or the second solution rather, is that there are various prosecutors around the country who have basically been finding workarounds, who don't have legislation in place that allows them to review sentences, but they're kind of trying to go ahead anyway. So you have Dan Satterberg, he's been supporting clemency applications for people who are sentenced under Washington State's 3 strikes law. In Georgia, there's a group of district attorneys who already agreed to reevaluate drug sentences and have really actually helped some people go home. And in California, actually, where they do have this law that allows for sentence review, There was no opposition whatsoever from any prosecutor in the state when that law came for a vote. So we actually see enthusiasm among prosecutors for this kind of thing. In fact, the first person, it's believed to be the first person, was freed under the new law in San Diego recently. So that was exciting. I'd say that there's a couple things to keep in mind. One of them is that the most likely reason that there was no opposition from prosecutors when that California law was being considered is that the law doesn't really force prosecutors to do anything, right? Like, they don't have to reduce any sentences at all. The law only empowers them to do something if they want to. And I think that that's something that everyone should keep in mind, which is that if we recognize that prosecutors, who really are adversaries, and often work to gain convictions, that's what they see as their job, if they are in large part to blame for the mass incarceration crisis, it's maybe not going to be the most effective strategy to further empower them, right? At the very least, it relies on prosecutors to do the right thing. And so I'm sure you will see various prosecutors who will do the right thing with these laws if they had them on the books. But I think that a lot of prosecutors would just do nothing. So we can't say that this is a cure-all, right? And, you know, a little bit more disturbing is that the same prosecutor in San Diego who petitioned for this first guy to be released under the sentence review law in California, she actually, we've heard from public defenders in her jurisdiction that she has been having defendants agree as a condition of a plea deal to a deal that makes their sentences basically review proof. So no change in law will ever be able to change those sentences. And that's a problem, right? Because what it means is that this prosecutor is saying, my judgment today is as far as we're gonna go. And it doesn't leave room for any further sort of review or reform. And so I think that when we think about sentence review, it's necessary, it's fantastic. If we can get it up and running in all the states or more states, that's great, especially if the progressive prosecutor movement continues. But I also think we have to think about it as one tool among many that we're going to need.
Thank you, Sarah. I really love the idea of these units. And in a little bit, Molly's going to talk about things that the volunteers can do to kind of get engaged with that. But first, Celeste, can you talk to us about what you're doing at FAM?
Absolutely. So, I mean, Pennsylvania has some of the absolute worst sentencing laws on the books, and we see that reflected in how large our prison population is in the state. And so a lot of the work that we're doing here on the ground, we're working with a lot of coalition partners who've been doing this work as well. But we definitely, you know, mandatory minimums were struck down here in Pennsylvania in 2015, and we've seen some great things afterward. You know, it's not like our prison population has skyrocketed and crime's going crazy. It's actually the opposite. We've seen that, you know, since mandatory minimums were struck down in Pennsylvania, our prison population has reduced. Violent crime and property crime has actually gone down. And the Department of Corrections has saved money, and they've been able to actually close facilities. And they actually, I believe just yesterday, announced that they were going to plan to close another state correctional institution here in Pennsylvania. And it's really been an interesting thing. And so when we're looking at the work that we're doing in Pennsylvania, we definitely want to make sure that we are stopping any sort of mandatory minimum sentencing from coming back. We've seen people try to do it, both in the House and the Senate. We've seen people really try to, you know, stick to that tough on crime idea, but we know that it doesn't work. And so we're really trying to stop that from coming back. And when we're talking about those mandatory minimums, that definitely includes ending life without parole in Pennsylvania. You know, we also have not only, you know, 5,400 people serving life without parole, we have the highest rate of juveniles serving life without parole in the country. And so we really need to start looking at that. And we have great legislation in the House and the Senate to try to end life without parole. But all it does is allow parole eligibility for people. And so many people, when we talk about ending life without parole, the initial response is this knee-jerk reaction, like we're going to just open up the gates and let absolutely everybody just run out at once. And that's not the case. You know, parole eligibility in this legislation is just that. you still have to prove that you are able to go before the parole board, and the parole board still has to make that decision. It's still a lot of work for people to be able to go and get actual relief through that process. And so, we're really hoping that people call their legislators and let them know that, we really do want parole eligibility for our people who are serving these really, really bad sentences in Pennsylvania. And I think another thing is when we're talking about excessive sentencing, we have to look at community corrections. We have to look at probation and parole reform. And we have some great probation reform stuff going on in the House and the Senate here as well in Pennsylvania. Actually, on September 24th, we're going to have a huge probation reform rally at the Capitol in Harrisburg. So if you're around in Pennsylvania, try to come out and join us. We're going to be meeting with legislators and their staff and letting them know that, we need and desire and deserve probation reform here in Pennsylvania. So we're really, really feeling very good about that. The Senate had a great 2-day hearing on the Senate bill back in June. So we feel really, really positive about this movement that we have here in Pennsylvania to try to end the burden that these excessive punishments place on communities. If we can change that and try to make our communities more whole, we can definitely, reduce crime, we can keep our communities safe, and we can treat people like humans. And it just seems so simple, but it's a fight. And so if you're ready to join, you can definitely try to reach out and join up with what we're doing here at FAM. And, if you're a family member, you have somebody incarcerated, definitely reach out. We're trying to create a really good community support around the country, not just in Pennsylvania, for federal and state issues as well.
Thank you so much, Celeste, and thank you to all of our panelists. I know this issue is huge and we could talk about it forever, but we are excited to see how we can partner our volunteers with you all. And so to that end, Molly is going to talk a little bit about our justice volunteers.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kelly, and thank you again to Sarah, Erlan, Kate, and Celeste. We feel really lucky to have you sharing your expertise and time with us. So thank you again. And thank you also to all of you volunteers who joined us today. This is our biggest attendance group for a webinar, so we're really excited about that and about growing that number as we do more webinars in future months as well. I just really quickly want to go over some of what we have to offer as justice volunteers and then talk a little bit about the momentum we're hoping to keep from this webinar before we get to questions. So just really quickly, for those of you that aren't already active in some of our teams, we sort of have 3 teams under our Justice Volunteers umbrella. We do a lot of research to help fuel a lot of the work that we do to change the narrative and try to educate people about issues that are going on nationally and then locally as well. So we have a research team that engages in a lot of that research remotely, and sometimes there's some in-person aspects to research as well. We also do a lot of media amplification, so taking important articles or messages and trying our best to circulate them online so that people have access to information on these issues as much as possible. And then thirdly is our action team, where we're doing our best to partner with lots of different organizations on the ground to share information about events like the one Celeste just mentioned in Pennsylvania that's happening, and connect you with all of those experiences and events as much as we can. And so we use online resources to share that information with you. And then often these teams intersect a lot, as does a lot of the, aspects of the reform movement. We heard a lot today about the importance both of changing things on the policy and legislative levels, but then also about changing the narrative in an important way. And I think one of the things that Justice Volunteers has done so effectively is to prove that there are many people that feel this way, and then in that way we can both change the narrative in our communities and put some pressure on people that we've elected to office of different types to help make that change a reality. So in that spirit, one of the things we're hoping to do right in the direct wake of this webinar is to have a petition that we'd love for you to help join us in, which is to express support for sentence review mechanisms that Sarah just talked about in awesome detail. If you are interested in that, we can share that information with you. So we're just going to have a poll pop up here, right here in the webinar. The first question is going to be about whether or not you would like to join us in the petition. And then if you're interested in any of our volunteer teams, whether it's research, media, or action team. And I don't know if there's a poll popping up. Great. So we have it there. So if you could just take a quick minute to fill out those questions. If you sign up for any of these things, what we'll do is we'll reach out to you individually to make sure you have all the information that you need to get started. So thank you so much again for doing that. As you're filling that out too, I'd like to just quickly turn it over to Celeste, who I think has one more opportunity for people to get involved before we move on to all the questions that we have.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to quickly mention FAM's Visit a Prison Challenge that we kicked off July 8th. We're really challenging all policymakers at the federal, local, state, every level to actually go in and visit a prison and not just take a tour, but actually talk to the people inside. You know, our idea is if people don't go, they won't know. And so unless you actually go into a prison and talk to the people inside and realize how wonderful they can be, and actually take that time to go in, you know, you're not going to actually know what goes on. And we think that if people are making decisions and writing legislation about people who have offended, until they actually go inside and meet those people, they really don't have the authority to you know, make those decisions correctly. And so we're really hoping that, you know, in Pennsylvania, we've seen a lot of people join and actually take that challenge and go in. I've actually gone in with quite a few legislators myself and visited the prison. And every single time the reaction is wonderful. The lawmakers say, wow, we really do need to make a change in our sentencing laws. And so, you know, challenge your lawmaker to go in and visit a prison, no matter where they are, even if they're a candidate. Please challenge your lawmakers to visit a prison. If you just hashtag visit a prison or look on FAM's social, there's all kinds of stuff about it, you know, press kits and things like that. We've seen such a great response. And I think that if we keep this going and try to keep more people accountable for going into prisons if they're writing legislation about people who have offended, I think we can really make a big difference in shifting that narrative that we were talking about earlier.
Celeste, thank you so much. And that's absolutely something we'll include with our justice volunteers. And so now I know that we're winding down on the hour, but if you can stick around, we're gonna try to touch on a couple questions that you guys have posed to our panelists. And so the first one is gonna be a little bit of a combination of two. So one question is, what can be done here in Louisiana that has the biggest jail population of all states? And then another question is, which states have the most extreme sentencing? And what efforts can we do to support them there?
I can take the Louisiana question. There's an organization that I've been in touch with, the Louisiana Promise of Justice Initiative, and they've been working on some legislation. Louisiana has actually an incredibly high number of people in prison, and they actually approach California levels for the actual LWOP. It's almost 5,000 people in LWOP in the state, much, much smaller population-wise than California, and they have an additional almost 5,000 people who are considered life. So the questioner is absolutely right. Louisiana is a state with a very high incarceration rate. So the Promise of Justice Initiative, and they have one of their suggestions is that they amend their second-degree murder law, similar to what Celeste was talking about in Pennsylvania. That can also lead to LWOP, as can some of their habitual offender, their 3 strikes can lead to LWOP. And so they have some proposals legislatively to end that. To amend their laws in that way, and to also return Louisiana, as Sarah was saying, it was a corrective. Louisiana actually used to have a system where I believe it was if you served 20 years and were 50 years old, you could get released or a meaningful opportunity for parole. They want to revive that concept in Louisiana.
Celeste, I know you talked a lot about Pennsylvania. Just wanted to check if you wanted to chime in a little bit more here.
Yeah, I mean, if people want to get involved in the work that we're doing in Pennsylvania, we actually have a really cool text line set up. You can text FAM, which is FAMM, to 21333. Yes, there's 21333. And you'll automatically get signed up for text messages about the things that we're doing here in Pennsylvania. There are a lot of organizations who are working on the ground, and there are so many ways that you can get involved. I know on FAM's website, we have all kinds of petitions you can sign that will automatically go to your lawmakers to tell them that they should support reform. Definitely, lawmakers work for us. And I think that not enough people realize that we are their bosses. And so if there's something that you want from them, hold them accountable, make them know who you are, go and show up. And there are also some really great organizations on the ground doing this work to try to end life without parole in Pennsylvania. The biggest one for me is CADB, which is the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration. And they are really run by a lot of people who were formerly sentenced to life without parole, or have family members who are sentenced to life without parole, or, they are a dual victim where they have a family member who is sentenced to life without parole for a homicide, but they've also lost family members and loved ones to homicide as well. And so their authority in this conversation is so unique. And so we're really lucky to be able to partner with them on a lot of different events to try to shift that narrative, to try to show that there are people who might have offended terribly at one point in time, but that shouldn't define who they are as a person.
Thank you. And this last question, I'm going to direct it specifically to Sarah and Celeste, but Kate and Caroline, you absolutely can jump in because we're talking so much about how to change the narrative, and we can do this in our conversations and how we write about it and how we ask for reform. So the question is how to change the narrative in the general population to see people impacted by the criminal justice system as humans and in the lock them up and throw them away kind of mentality.
Well, I actually wanted to do something a little sneaky. I think, it's very clear that once you see someone as a human, it's much harder to be inclined to lock them up and throw away the key. I think what we see in so much press coverage is dehumanization of certain groups of people, based so much less on what they have done or allegedly done, and so much more on the type of person they are. That can be incredibly powerful. And we know that people are actually capable. I mean, even the public at large is very capable of looking past someone's misdeeds. You can see no shortage of examples of, powerful, beloved white people who do not suffer the same kinds of consequences for misdeeds that others do. And so it's not that it's a lost cause, it's just that we have to do better raising up. So I think there's a few elements to that. One is if you see that someone who is a more powerful, more privileged, entitled person getting lenient treatment, it's always important not to demand that that person gets harsher treatment, but rather to demand that others simply get the same treatment, right? When you see a tech billionaire like we saw in Nevada recently get a sweetheart deal, don't say that's messed up, he should go to prison forever. What did the public defenders in Las Vegas start doing? They started demanding that all of their indigent clients get the same deal and then asking the judge why if they don't, right? It seems like the only thing that's different are my client's resources or the color of his or her skin. So I think that's a big part of the narrative shifting. Another part of the narrative shifting is just helping people get to know other people. Visiting a jail or prison is important, but even that, it's a difficult way to actually get to know people. And so I kind of wanted to put Erlan on the spot because I feel like Erlan has done an amazing job of helping people in the public get to know other people, including yourself, right? But I think including with this kind of respect and sensitivity, the way that you and Nigel treated everybody or continue to treat everybody that's on the show, not judging or sort of making excuses for, but simply saying, hey, this is a human, right? Listen to his story or her story. And I kind of wanted to ask you, Erlan, how that feels from your perspective and how you view that work, and maybe if you have any thoughts about in a certain way being a poster child for that sort of thing, and whether that's how conscious was that? Yeah, if you don't want to answer, that's fine too.
It's a lot to that, I could just go back to even prisons. I think the underlying reasons for prisons or the objections is to for individuals to find what's wrong in their life and correct it. And I think a lot of people do that, and they do that within the first if they sentence to life, they do that within the first 5 to 10 years. And when it comes to changing the narrative, I think people change their own narratives, you know what I'm saying? And with us, we were able to bring it to, or should I say, we were able to open up that curtain for everybody to look inside and see people. You know, we got an opportunity to do that. And then when people start seeing people for who they are today, they change their perspective of what they've been thinking about when it comes to corrections. Because a lot of people, you know, you are of a criminal mindset when you're in that courtroom. You know, you do have a criminal mindset at that point. But then as time goes on, everybody changed. You know, I can ask everybody on this panel, what was y'all doing 15 years ago that y'all wouldn't be doing today? You know, or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and people will have a different perspective. So for us, especially with the stories that we do at Ear Hustle, it's more like we're not trying to do like stories about redemption and all that. We're just trying our best to just tell everyday stories of what life is like inside prison. Currently, we're at San Quentin, which is a level 2. Hopefully next season we'll be at a level 4, where it's, you know, maximum security, and we can go inside that mindset, you know, and what individuals face there. But I think we try our best to humanize a sequestered population that nobody knows nothing about. And I didn't know nobody knew nothing about people in prison. I didn't even pay attention to that when we started it. I thought everybody knew everything, but I learned that media is not invited inside and stuff like that. So I think we were able to have success because nobody was pretty much, I want to say, on the ground inside like we were. But I think I think if you sit a mic in front of somebody and they respect what you do, they're going to open themselves up and let you know exactly what's going on with them. So our biggest, I think, contribution to this is just basically trying to humanize people, men and women.
And I think that's really important in the whole scheme of things, is that, you know, we need to use humanizing language. And I think that we need to start holding the media accountable for the language that they're using to describe people who have been in prison or people who have offended. You know, when you look at certain headlines, you know, I remember there was somebody who was running for school board who had a felony conviction in like 1981 or something. They were running for school board this year, right? But the headline was, you know, felon running for school board and something. And it's like, wait a minute, this man has a name. You know, he had a conviction and served his sentence back in the early 80s, and he's running for school board. Not many people want to run for that job, right? And so that's what we should be talking about, not something that has been done all those times ago. And what really bothers me is, like, one of the best, I think, examples of this in the media is when we look at like the Central Park 5 situation. You know, all of those things that were in the news media about them, they called them animals. They called them these, you know, raving lunatics, and they were children. And they were innocent. And so, you know, the way that the media shapes these stories and these narratives, that's what a lot of people, that's where they get a lot of their information. Most people don't do the research to try to get to know somebody who has been inside. Most people just take at face value what the news says. You know, we see how the news portrays crime, right? We see some people get mugshots shown and some people get happy-go-lucky school photos or photos with their families shown. And until we start really holding the media accountable for the way that they're shaping our narrative around criminal justice and criminal legal reform, we're not going to really make a difference. So I think that calling people out who are on the news or who are writing these articles, that's really, really important, because some people just don't understand that that's dehumanizing and damaging.
Can I say one thing before we might be wrapping up? I'm not sure, but I do want to. I've been thinking about this, and I think about this in terms of life without the possibility of parole in particular, and that a lot of that increase came about because that was the sort of the choice between, you can either have the death penalty or you can have LWOP, right? And LWOP is death by incarceration. It's just death by another name, okay? And that was a false choice that was given to us, right? And I don't think we would have chosen that. And so we took that. And I think, you know, something Celeste said made me think about this, like in the media, when we're presented with these sort of like, okay, well, we're not going to do, it's like that judge in Orange County, we're not going to do LWOP, we're going to do 175 to life. Well, that was, you know, BS. But we're going to do, LWOP, but we're going to do, an opportunity for parole. Okay, let's make sure we're not just making another false choice here. No, that has to be a meaningful opportunity for parole. That means after 15 years, after 20 years, parole is presumed, so we've got to be thinking one step ahead all the time. And I just, whatever legislation's coming down, whatever, progressive DA, it's like, okay, but we need to learn from the past and move this forward, and not accept the choices that are presented to us necessarily. That's it. That's my speech.
Thank you, Kate. And we're actually going to end it there. And so before you all sign off, we would love to get your feedback. And there should be a poll coming up asking you what you thought about the webinar and what issues you would like for us to focus on next. And so, do you see one? But as you fill that out, I want to take time to thank Kate, Erlan, Sarah, and Celeste so much for all of your insight. I know I learned a ton, and for giving us real concrete, action steps. So that is really important. And so thank you all so much for joining, and be sure to stay tuned for next month's webinar, which will focus on cash bail and the criminalization of poverty. So thank you all again so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.